Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Angie Grente and I'm joined today by my colleague Chelsea Kakook to talk about where to begin with optimizing payment acceptance costs, how to best leverage tools and technology with a focus on establishing some key KPIs. So thank you everyone for joining us. We will be going through the presentation. If you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them via the GoToWebinar chat or question function, and we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. So to begin, again, with Redbridge, we are a payments advisory firm. We partner with organizations to help them effectively optimize and manage their payment acceptance strategy. We focus on a number of areas throughout the payments chain, but today, Chelsea and thank you for joining me, Chelsea.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
We're going to be focused on where to begin and how to start with gathering data, what data you should be looking for effectively, and then how to develop KPIs to better understand and track and manage your payment strategy, especially as it evolves and grows. So we start at the beginning. Payment card acceptance specifically, I think as most of us are well aware, is complex. It only becomes more complex as we go on and strategies evolve. It's also costly and can be very challenging to manage proactively instead of in a reactive fashion. You want to make sure you're taking a holistic look and approach, looking at everything from interchange and how you're qualifying and optimizing those interchange qualifications, to leveraging how you connect and interact through points of sale, gateways, different payment channels, methods, understanding too the different geographies in which you operate, how that technology can impact costs and performance. So we'll take a step back, as I mentioned, and begin at the beginning, talking about the primary systems, the two primary systems in which payment card transactions occur today.
So looking into the two differences here, you can see the key points are the open loop system and the closed loop system. Looking at the open loop system, there's really 4 main participants versus the closed loop has 3. The best examples of this would be on the left-hand side for open loop, focusing on Visa or MasterCard, where you have the merchant, the acquirer, your card issuer, and your card network, versus the closed loop side would be a good example, American Express or a private label store issued card. So you have the merchant, your acquirer, and then the card issuing network.
And I think with each of these, it's also important to understand who these players are as we talk in terms of the entire payments chain. So you have, I guess, what could effectively begin with the card holder. So the individual or organization that holds that card and presents it for payment in whatever fashion, whether it be in person or online. You have the issuer or the institution that extended that card product to the card holder. You then have the players that you alluded to, Chelsea, in both the open loop and closed loop systems, as far as the merchants, acquirers, processors, and other associated service providers. That includes your middleware, your value-added resellers or VARs, and your gateways. This is in addition to also the other application service providers one might utilize. And why is this important to understand? Because understanding the payments flow is critical, and then understanding what type of data and information you need to capture and which of these partners in the payments ecosystem will have which pieces of information when we talk about taking that holistic view and picture. So as we go a little bit deeper into the acceptance side of it, the acquirer is the financial institution that is going to directly or indirectly, in the case of ISOs, enter into contractual relationships with merchants. So they're the ones that are facilitating that process, kind of the on-ramp to the card acceptance environment. The card holder we've discussed, the merchant or card accepting organization. This can be a large corporate, it can be a retailer, it could be business to business service. anyone that is in the active practice of accepting payments via payment card or other alternative payment method. Then you have your folks in the middle, like the gateways, the application service providers, your processors. Your processor is actually the agent that's providing for the authorization, clearing, and settlement. Many times the acquirer processor can appear as one and the same from the perspective of the merchant. And then you have the issuer, who again is the institution that is extending the credit to the card holder for that payment, whether it's a virtual card, whether it's a physical credit card, whether it's a card that's in a digital wallet. And why is the issuer important? Because a lot comes back to the issuer in terms of the cost of acceptance. And also when we start getting into optimization around authorizations, approvals, and fraud, feedback from the issuer can be critical to point of sale decisioning, as well as which transactions will be approved and or declined.
Looking at your providers, they do offer varying benefits and formats for the services and tools and deliverables they offer. And this is important before you sign or negotiate with the selected vendors you're looking at. You want to understand what your benefits can be, how that reporting is going to come through, what services they offer, the tools you're going to have access to, just to ensure that you're capturing and understanding all of the data and information that's available to you from your providers.
And I think this is really important too, is even understanding who those providers are in the value chain. Some of it is driven by the type of business, the type of payments you want to accept, the different payment channels you want to utilize, but also the different geographies can dictate which types of payment methods are going to best lend themselves to creating a frictionless environment. You want to be cognizant of local payment methods as well as some of the more global or widely accepted payment methodologies. And sometimes it can be a challenge to even understand who you are truly utilizing, because there can be various layers. And when you add those layers, it can also then serve to obscure some of the data and information. So when you are talking in terms of getting a good understanding at the onset of your payments environment, understanding first who all of your key partners and providers are, how they interact with one another, what their contribution is to the payment value chain, and then ultimately enabling you and empowering you to have conversations around what's the best method of collecting the data and information that they're able to supply so that you get that complete and holistic picture. Because oftentimes, I know in our experience working with organizations, you may look at an acquirer processor statement and think that's the totality of the activity or the cost. And for some it may be, but for many it's not. So it's having a good understanding of how those players come together, how they work together, which geographies they cover, and also too, as you build out into the future, making sure that you have the right providers and partners in place to help you grow your payment strategy as it evolves. So understanding everything from who's providing the acquiring services or processing services to your gateways to who's helping facilitate transactions at the point of interaction. And as we start bringing this in, it's why is that important? We talk a lot about this. Okay, so why, and what do I want to do with it? And when we talk in terms of establishing some basic understanding of the environment and key KPIs, it kind of comes down to three key goals. Getting visibility, whether it's regional, domestic, or global visibility into all of your related costs of acceptance, how different payment methods are performing, authorizations, fraud, approval rates, all of that. You want to have complete visibility across the value chain. It also then looks at accountability. Once you have the information and the visibility, you can then hold yourselves from an organizational standpoint, as well as your partners and providers, accountable to executing upon that strategy that you have defined, both meeting your future state objectives as well as your current state objectives, as well as your future state objectives. And then from there, looking at opportunities to improve upon and drive additional efficiencies, whether it's from a tools and technology perspective, an architecture perspective, point of interaction, eliminating friction from a customer perspective, or even just a cost perspective. These are all really key components that come from being able to capture that view on your global acceptance practices. So we'll stop here and take a pause. I think we have our first poll question, which we'd like to ask the audience.
Does your organization have a well-defined process for evaluating, monitoring, and managing payment card costs?
This is always interesting because we usually get a number of answers and they vary the gamut. But we'll give everybody a
few seconds here
to weigh in. And that's okay, because I think some organizations have a very well-defined process that can be fine-tuned and adapted, while others, are looking for simply where to begin. And that's okay, as long as you're asking the question and you're focusing on what can be done to improve, you're on the right track.
You're moving the right way.
I think here we can publish. Okay, great. So yeah, so we've got over 50% that does have a well-defined process, and then the balance are working on it.
Yes.
In some way, shape, or form, or at least here today to discuss it. Okay.
So looking at the basics of a merchant statement, we'll start from, the good old statement you're receiving. What does a statement provide? It's providing you with insight, giving you the tools to manage and look at your payment acceptance activity. It provides control, a bill for services, provides a record of your applicable card brand fees and assessments, so you have that record to look back on and track, and also a library, providing you with all of the details specific to your interchange qualification, the fees, the assessments, and the line items that have been charged. But I think the most important thing here is, even though you're receiving these, this statement with this information, there is no standard in terms of what you're going to receive. You may receive very, very, very detailed line item from one of your acquirers or gateways or providers, but you may also receive very high level, transaction details from another provider.
And that's kind of the key challenge. And it also, a lot of this too is driven by, location and where you are. Within the US, we have, well, there's no uniform reporting standard, as you mentioned, Chelsea. There are, at least, I think we are further along than in some areas of the world from availability of information or accessibility of information. But oftentimes you have to work with your providers to ensure that you're set up to be able to really capitalize upon the data and information that they can supply. In other areas, certain parts of Europe, Asia Pacific, there can be challenges with the data and information that's available, and you really have to dig and work in a collaborative fashion with your providers to set up the type of reporting that you want to see, agree upon the frequency, and then work to check it. Because I know in certain situations with providers that we support on a global level, a lot of what we do is just building that foundation and being able to intervene and work with the providers to set up consistent reporting and accurate reporting.
Right.
So it's first getting an assessment of, again, who you're working with today, what type of information can they supply. I mean, general rule of thumb, to the extent that you can drill down to the most granular level, that's the level of information that you should be collecting. Because as you talk about developing a library, being able to compare against historical data, start to facilitate benchmarking, really having that granular detail is helpful. Also starting sooner than later to capture that information so you have more information with which to compare. So for a lot of the large acquirers here in the US, working with them to set up the daily feeds and daily reporting that gives you access to your transaction level information is key, and that's a great starting point. It also helps you with then reconciling against the monthly statement information that you should be receiving electronically today, whether it's via PDF, an Excel, or a CSV file. You should have that monthly summary, which is effectively that billing summary or bill of record, to which you can then compare against the transaction level detail. The transaction level detail will help you in drilling down into transaction level interchange qualifications, obviously ensuring as well when you're reconciling that the statement fees and pricing are correct, in line and in accordance with the agreements and the pricing schedules that are in place. And that's for transaction fees and all other related services, making sure that even the published interchange rates are being charged correctly, or that scheme fees or assessments are being applied correctly. But that transaction level detail also gives you insights into the type of cards and payments you're seeing. That's really important for organizations to have that insight, especially as you're evaluating different payment channels, payment options, payment mix, alternative payment methods. You know, a lot of the organizations that are getting into the buy now, pay later, if they don't have the visibility with which to understand what type of card activity they're seeing, when, how, it's going to be challenging to prove whether expanding acceptance into some of these alternative payment methods has been beneficial to them or not. Right. Because there's the cost, and if you can prove internally that there is the return, then great. If you can't, then you're left struggling and asking what is the benefit to us. Same thing can be said for chargebacks. So having the insight and consistent reporting around chargebacks, frequencies, reason codes can help the organization with more proactively evaluating that activity monthly and making course corrections as needed when changes do occur. And I think here we have our second polling question.
I'd like to take a quick break. And what do you consider to be the biggest challenges in managing payment acceptance costs?
So we'll give
card brand fees, acquire fees, rule and regulatory changes, routing practices.
And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. That list can go on for
we can drill down much further
for days, and I think we've touched upon some here. But that's one of the biggest challenges. Is it's not, you know, there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of components, and a lot of data that sits behind the card acceptance environment. All right, so we'll get those last votes in on the poll, and then let's see what folks think.
Thank you.
All right, well, this is great. Thank you. So it sounds like it's kind of split here between
card brand, rule and regulatory changes.
And I would say that is in line with our experience as well. Probably one of the more straightforward, at least in the US, can be the acquire fees themselves, but certainly keeping up with the brand fees and the rule and the regulatory changes. The brands do a good job of keeping us on our toes, and April
and October
was no exception this year as well, as organizations are still navigating, and I think just now taking a look at what the impact was. One of the big benefits of being able to drill into this information is having the insight so that you can model and be able to ascertain and determine what type of impact these changes are going to have prospectively versus reactively. And I know for many of the organizations that we partner with, this is a large part of the exercise, especially when it comes to budgeting each year for acceptance costs, because it does create such a significant line item. Is not only understanding what is happening today, but how do you take prospectively those changes from the card brands, the rule and regulatory requirements, what is that impact going to be on the environment? So
trying to predict towards the future of those changes and how they'll affect you.
So I think basically starting, being able to break down at a very basic level volumes and transactions, and then be able to put this information and data together in the view that best supports your organization and your internal stakeholders.
By looking at multiple layers here, you're able to keep things at a high level, but then also drill down to a granular level. And I think this is important, as Angie had mentioned, when you're trying to understand if there may be opportunities to expand or look at other payment channels. And if you don't have the ability to look at these transactions and fees split out, Oftentimes you cannot understand if the change you've made has been successful or really brought any cost reductions, or if it's driven, clients into different channels. So this is just showing, high level information and then broken out by your card brand, which can be beneficial when you're looking at that effective rate across different channels of the cards and debit or other or private label.
Yeah, and I think too, this is where also having the more granular version of the data is important, because under each of these categories, as you start getting into establishing the daily feeds with the transaction level detail, you can go further. So breaking down your debit transactions, you can start looking at routing preferences. Do you have a routing strategy today? If not, should you consider one? If you do have one, is it performing to your expectations? Being able to understand what type of activity you're seeing, how the routing is performing for you. Similarly, as we talked a little bit ago about alternative payment methods, buy now, pay later, which is one of the hot topics, but understanding the type of activity that you're seeing by method, because many organizations have more than one buy now, pay later solution. And what is the performance, not only from a cost standpoint, but from a customer return or retention standpoint? How many repeat customers have you won? How many new customers, like new customer acquisition statistics, are you able to gather from that data? And then, even average ticket, average basket size. How is that performing by brand type? You can drill down and also look at this by issuer if you have any specific incentive related agreements to determine, which issuers are performing or are processing. I'm sorry. You're processing, which issuers are you encountering most frequently from a credit perspective, from a debit perspective, from a check card perspective.
And I think really quick too, another item here is if you are just, at that Visa, MasterCard, Discover level, this is a good time to think if you may have opportunities for expanding your debit acceptance, expanding your American Express or those other card brands, and options such as buy now, pay later.
Yeah, and it lends itself to, along with looking at cost, as you're having conversations with the brands themselves, like you said, opening up acceptance. Are there certain payment channels that you limit acceptance today, or that you haven't historically accepted card? Or do you know what the card mix looks like? Effective rates, that's a general term. I think we hear that a lot. Really, effective rates can be any, they can measure a lot of different attributes. You can look at overall cost of acceptance. You can look at effective rate by payment type, method, payment channel, by the brand itself. You can go to interchange specific effective rates. But effective rates can be really helpful once you have them established and helping you pick up on trends. If you're looking simply at a global effective rate, that can oftentimes be too broad. Well, it's helpful and it's good information to know. It can be too broad because you're not able to pick up fast enough on nuances. And while it might only be a couple of basis points here or there, those changes in effective rate can create a significant impact financially very quickly. So as we look at effective rates, it's important to understand what you want to measure, which effective rates are important to your organization, and then be able to have the data and information to set up that effective rate and be able to review it month over month, year over year, so that you can draw some really meaningful comparisons.
Looking at managing your relationships by leveraging data, it's important to keep in mind the environment that you have. Up above, you can see by looking at your relationships with the card brands, it gives you that insight so that when you go into your negotiations and looking at your vendor and partner relationships, you have the ability to use that to your advantage in your negotiations and your growth, and where you may want to drive your focus towards the future for your payments.
Yeah, and there are a lot of relationships that you can manage more effectively by using this data and information. So when we talk in terms of like routing practices, for example, we're talking about taking transactions and understanding when a card is presented. We'll just take debit, for example. When a card is presented, a debit card specifically, you may have options as to which network you can route that transaction. And certain networks may be more favorable from a cost standpoint. You may have an agreement in place to provide incentives for utilizing a certain network. You may have allocated or committed a certain amount of volume to a network. So you want to look at those routing practices. It's hard to do that if you don't have the data or information, because you're doing it after the fact. And sometimes after the fact can be a quarter after the fact, it can be annually after the fact, and that's much too late. So if you have this information set up today, you can better understand from the type of card activity that you're seeing, what type of network activity you're seeing from a debit perspective, from a credit perspective. On the issuing side, we talk about issuers and their role. They play a big role in decisioning transactions from an authorization or decline rate. If you're having decline issues, it could be that it stems down when you drill down to a certain issuer. Where is the information or the lapse happening? There could be something systematically that's contributing to these false declines. And those false declines can be costing your organization money, they can be creating friction with your customers. So having the data and the insights helps you have these conversations in a more real-time or near-time fashion than after the fact, a year later when it's too late. Same thing can be said for the brands, right? In the conversations that you're having with the brands themselves, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express, as you're seeking to expand those relationships, create meaningful partnerships, this data can help you because it can show what type of penetration you have within not only the brands themselves, but also within the type of products that those brands offer. So it helps you have more meaningful relationships built on real timely data. And of course, another piece of the value chain is interchange. So Chelsea, I'll let you talk to this, but I know for many organizations, and kind of coming back to basics and the cost component, interchange in the US alone represents probably the lion's share, roughly 85% of the cost of accepting cards. So.
Right, being the main component of your merchant fees, it's important to understand just the basics of how the interchange qualification, how it basically goes through the ranks. So we would hope that the majority of the transactions are qualifying at base rates or better, right? But if something is missing for whatever reason, causing that transaction to not meet the requirements, it's going to process at a more costly rate, which we would label as a downgrade, so the red category. But once you're back at the base rates, you do have opportunities for optimizing the interchange in certain areas. That can be through MCC codes that are specific for certain industries. Visa, MasterCard, the card brands have taken that to apply certain interchange rates given the certain industries. So charity, universities, B2B. So it's very important that you know what your MCC is and check if that's been applied correctly. Additionally, from there, you have the opportunity on those business and corporate card transactions to send additional line item detail, which can then provide additional reduced rates by sending that level 2 and 3, and then the other category being large ticket, which is applicable, I think, on transactions over 8,600 and around that $10,000 range.
Yeah, and these are just even some of the basics too, because for many organizations, part of the challenge too is if they have proprietary rates or customized incentives that they have in place, also being able to track and make sure that they're qualifying those correctly. You touched upon the MCC. Those can be tricky because they can be applied, even at the individual mid-level, and making sure you have the right MCC in place based on the business activity. So how do you do that? Again, with the data and information from both a daily transaction level perspective as well as a monthly statement perspective, making sure you're able to capture your qualifications. So this is one that for organizations that maybe don't have a system in place today, starting with a conversation with your providers to make sure that your reporting actually supports this information, that you have true pass-through with visibility into the rates that were applied. Many acquirers will use codes or reference codes. You have to have the right set with which to decrypt those codes, to translate them back to which interchange rates were applied. You also have to make sure that the right rate itself and per item was applied, and then be able to understand the various volumes from a dollar volume perspective and a transaction volume perspective that went through each rate or for each category each month. And this is important because you have to have a baseline to know where you sit today and then be able to improve upon it. And you really want to be able to measure if you have made changes. Interchange can deteriorate just as quickly as it can improve. And so once you have things in place, you have to continue to manage it. But also if you do put a fix into place, you want to be able to measure performance and make sure that it's having the intended impact. I think we have an example here where you can see just how significant these changes can be. I think this example specifically is related to adding level 3 data. So this would be for corporate and commercial card transactions. But for an organization that's processing a fair amount of volume, it's what translates to roughly a 40 basis point differential, which is significant and adds up. And I think we've seen organizations that see 3 to 5 basis point fluctuations that can very quickly turn into 7-figure issues.
Right, and going back to your card mix, it's important, this would be in that business and corporate card. And so if you have a small share of that right now and you're monitoring that, and then you see that start to increase for, whatever reason you may have made changes, at first the level 3 opportunity may have been minimal and it may not be worth the level of effort and the cost on your IT team or implementing that new solution. But just knowing where it started and then monitoring it month over month, if you do see those increases, that's when you can determine if it's going to be a profitable change or implementation.
Absolutely. Another area that can very quickly become costly to manage are chargebacks. And there are a lot of factors that go into chargebacks, but having the visibility. So we're not talking so much here about the process itself of managing the chargebacks and disputes. That's important, but evaluating what's happening. Every month, what type of frequency are you seeing with chargebacks? What are the reason codes? And having that information can allow you to act on it. Are you seeing dramatic changes, increases in certain types of chargebacks under certain reason codes? And then what are the steps from there you can take to intervene? Because chargebacks are very expensive for organizations in many cases, where you have the time and the cost and the expense of having to track down that information internally if it's not automated or you don't have it outsourced to a third party. Even if you do, being able to gauge their performance and really measure the impact that it's having on your chargeback management process. Because if you wait to the point that you're down the road with the chargebacks and you haven't taken any of the steps, it's really too late. This becomes a sunk cost. You can't proactively make changes. You're really reactive in your approach to amending the process, and it creates friction with customers. It creates friction internally, and you're probably never going to eliminate chargebacks altogether, but there is an optimum.
And I think looking at it from both a high level perspective and then drilling down if it is by mid-level or store level, because even though it may look balanced and stagnant, but if you drill down and you realize it's just in a couple locations, you can focus more on those locations and try to bring that down.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's why, again, it comes back to this message of having the data and information and being able to secure it at the most granular level. And then two, we keep talking about this, but making sure that you have the flexibility to manipulate and present the data in a fashion that's most meaningful, and understanding who your stakeholders are. Some stakeholders are going to want a very global view, top level. Others are going to want to be able to drill down with certain aspects by geography, by business unit, by product, whatever it may be. And if you're really struggling with your system to create that picture, and everything it requires manual intervention, then that proves to be even more challenging. So it's creating a system that's flexible to support your needs and the needs of your internal stakeholders.
And when it all comes together, it can be a beautiful thing.
Yes.
The benefits can be substantial. You can, by taking your data, understanding your data, determining the best methods of bringing it in and harmonizing that information and actually putting it to work for you, monitoring your KPIs, how to best mitigate your cost increases and how to predict those cost increases as best you can, looking towards the future to determine where you may see spikes and where there may be opportunity to, you know, move volume or, you know, look for new openings.
Yeah, and I think the big key here too is subtle changes can have significant impact. So the having a solution, whether it's a solution that you've worked to develop in-house or a third-party solution that you utilize, but having something that supports your organization and grows with your organization to give you more real-time data and information is key. You want to be able to, if you're looking at, you know, controlling, you know, fraud filters, deploying a new solution, what is the impact? And you don't want to wait a year to find that out. You don't want to wait 6 months. You want to be able to see what is the impact for the organization, what is the impact for the customers, looking at authorizations and approvals, what type of impact does that have? So it's certainly cost and managing costs, but it's also increasing performance and really creating a payments environment that's conducive to supporting your customers and making sure that their transactions are able to process as efficiently as possible and for the most cost-effective means possible. And, you know, trying to do that in arrears is challenging. So making sure you have the flexibility, making sure you have the data, and then making sure that you have the capacity to drill down and understand that data. Because the other piece too is once you have all the data and you harness it, you have to be able to actually sit down, review it, draw conclusions, like you said, manage those KPIs, review them over time, and have meaningful discussions around, okay, how does this impact and shape the future? What do we want to do in the next 6 months or the next 12 months based on what we've learned to this point? So it's having the data, it's utilizing the data, it's being able to make actionable changes and really take your payments acceptance and your overall strategy to the next level.
Thank you.
So with that, I know we've covered the basics, you know, quickly here in 30 minutes, but we will go ahead and open it up for any questions that we may have. If again, you want to add those in the questions drop down our chat box. I think we have a couple coming in here. We could start, it looks like Chelsea, you have
one. I think
one.
we have one question regarding KPIs. What KPIs do you see clients tracking frequently? I think if we were going to say most popular KPIs, I'd say overall effective rate's very important, but then chargeback ratios have been, you know, monitoring the chargebacks, understanding your indicators and what the reason codes are, auth ratios, and then your interchange cost, interchange effective rate.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's probably a good starting point. Let's see the next question we have. Okay, if we have more than one provider, how can we compare the data? This is a good question. So yes, it's certainly challenging. Not, as we talked about earlier, there's not a uniform reporting format. But when you're talking about harmonizing data, first of all, it's to understand the frequency and make sure you're comparing like to like and apples to apples. So just starting at a monthly standpoint, making sure that you're getting monthly summary data from your providers. And then I think the basic kind of goes to what you were saying, Chelsea, with KPIs, mapping and tagging of the data. Start by identifying what are interchange related costs.
From there, interchange split out.
Yep, and then which, like, what's the Visa interchange versus the MasterCard interchange would be a really good place to start at a basic level. Also understanding what the assessments are and the brand fees, so that you can compare from provider like to like interchange, like to like brand fees, along with your volumes, your transactions. And then the third component, of course, is creating an apples to apples comparison of your transaction fees or what you're paying to your acquirer or associated third-party providers. And I think if you can break it into those three buckets, that's a good starting point. I think we have a couple minutes left here.
Okay, one more question, Angie. What attributes do you recommend utilizing to calculate interchange effective rate?
Oh, that's great. So what attributes do we recommend utilizing to calculate interchange effective rate? So again, first is identifying which fees are truly interchange related fees. So you're typically going to have both a percentage-based fee component as well as the per item fee component. And then from there, a lot of organizations find it valuable to break it down first by brand. So you'd have your overall like Visa interchange cost of acceptance versus MasterCard. But then more so going down to say, what is my reward card specific cost of interchange versus check card cost of interchange versus corporate or purchasing card cost of interchange. And I think drilling down, so first by brand and then subsequently by card type is helpful in getting a good basic understanding of those interchange attributes.
All right, thank you. We have one more question. How much potential value is there in checking and reconciling pass-through interchange and scheme fees? Should I assume they are always broadly correct?
Another great question. This is a question that's been asked for quite some time. So yes, I mean, for most organizations, we take at face value that the fees reflected on the statement they're truly the correct and most appropriate fees. And to be candid, I mean, we've done these types of analyses at a very granular level. To be blunt, there are inconsistencies. It's not to say that every single month you're going to find glaring errors. You may not. Usually when we see challenges or discrepancies and around how the published rates were applied, first you have to go to the transaction level detail. So you have to look at the data at that level to say, okay, what was you look at the bin data, and then from there determine what was the interchange rate that should have been applied. Then you have to compare that to what was actually applied. If there's a discrepancy, usually we see those as the bin tables are refreshed or new bins are introduced, because some acquirers may just have a lag or lapse in how and when they've updated them. Also, other times that you can see a struggle there is when the new rates are introduced. Some acquirers can face challenges with timing around updating and making system changes, but it's a good thing to check, and not a lot of organizations do this. Some do, and some do it quite well. Others don't and take the provider's word for it. I think as you look at a high volume environment, it's just something you should be cognizant of, because there can be discrepancies. They can add up. Sometimes the provider will notify you of the issue and resolve it and reimburse you or rectify it. Other times they will not, because it may not even come up on their radar. Some of it will be client specific, some of them will be systemic. So it is something that should be evaluated, should be reconciled. And absolutely, I'm always one that says question and challenge it and make sure that you verified it yourself.
Last question I think that we've received: should we create our own data warehouse or rely on acquirers for support?
Ooh, these are all good questions. Yeah. So I think it depends. It depends on your organization and the resources that you have and the capabilities. If you're just getting started, I think you can start by having the conversation and utilizing and leaning on your acquirer, right? But if you have the capability, and especially I think a good number of the large retailers out there and others, I've seen it in insurance, I've seen it in other sectors where there's a pretty high volume of transaction activity, there should be some discussion about creating and maintaining your own data warehouse, because with that you can then, like the question before, then you can support and facilitate an audit. You can utilize, third parties. This is one area where I know we do a lot of work, is helping clients with that data warehouse, either them building it on their own or supporting it for them. But once you have the data and you have the resources in place to maintain it, there's so much value that you can create from there. Just, auditing, being able to look at trends, but just the value of the data itself. can be very significant. So I would say, yes, it's a discussion for each organization.
Depending on your environment.
But there are absolutely times that, you know, the organization should be having that conversation and moving forward with the resources to facilitate it internally versus externally. All right, well, I think we are at time. So appreciate everyone's time this morning. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. I think you can tell we're always happy to chat about anything payment related. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And have a great rest of your afternoon.